What if you could rewind the entire history of our planet with the press of a button, the kind that lets you watch 4.5 billion years of Earth's greatest hits in reverse? Hit rewind, and you'd watch our world die in the most spectacular ways imaginable. Cities would crumble back into forests. Forests would shrink back into seeds. Mountains would unbuild themselves like disappointed soufflés collapsing in reverse. Oceans would unfill like forgotten tea kettles evaporating backwards. And the sky itself would shift through colours that don't have names yet. You'd see meteors flying backwards out of impact craters, pulling their destruction with them like cosmic vacuum cleaners in reverse. Ice ages would freeze landscapes in rewind, covering alien-looking worlds that existed before the ice. Volcanoes would suck their fire back underground, and continents would drift back together like awkward dinner guests being forced into conversation. The air would grow thicker, then thinner, then so toxic you'd need a gas mask just to breathe through your television screen. Lightning would dance endlessly across skies the colour of rust and old blood. You'd watch massive creatures disappear into the mists of time, followed by smaller ones, then smaller still, until finally you're left with nothing but empty oceans under a sky that's never seen a cloud. And just when you think you've reached the end of the story, when Earth looks more like Mars than anything you'd want to visit for vacation, the real horror begins. Because this isn't where our story ends. This is where it begins. This is the world that somehow, impossibly, gave birth to everything you've ever known. Welcome to a planet that never wanted you here, and the 4 billion year accident that made your existence possible anyway. Now let me take you somewhere that you've never been, a time so hostile that even bacteria had to file insurance claims just to exist. This is Earth during the Precambrian. The sky hung like a rusty curtain, painted in shades that would make a sunset look optimistic by comparison. No blue anywhere, because blue skies are a luxury that takes a few billion years to develop. Lightning was practically the planet's full-time job, crackling endlessly through an atmosphere that was part greenhouse gas, part poison cocktail, and entirely unwelcoming to anything resembling life as we know it. The air itself was a chemistry experiment gone wrong, thick with methane, ammonia, and the kind of toxic gases that would make a volcano blush. Breathing, it would have been like trying to inhale liquid metal, assuming you had lungs, which you wouldn't, because lungs hadn't been invented yet. The oceans stretched across continents like vast primordial baths, filled with green acidic water that could dissolve bone. Hot enough to scald, acidic enough to burn, they contained dissolved minerals in concentrations that would choke any modern sea creature within seconds. Volcanic vents dotted the seafloor, breathing toxic gases into water that already reeked of sulfur and metal. They were chemical laboratories where the wrong reaction could sterilize entire regions. The continents drifted like massive rafts across a molten sea, crashing into each other with impacts that sent shockwaves around the globe. Mountains rose and fell within geological heartbeats, their peaks ground down by forces that could reshape entire landscapes overnight. Volcanoes erupted constantly, painting the sky with ash and filling the air with gases that would strip the paint off modern buildings. The ground trembled so frequently that stability was a foreign concept, a planet still learning how to hold itself together. What solid land existed was scarred by impact craters from the cosmic debris that hammered Earth like artillery shells from space. But here's what will keep you awake tonight, long after this story ends. Somewhere in all that chaos, in those toxic seas under that poisonous sky, something impossible was stirring. The first chapter of the most unlikely success story ever written. Deep beneath the waves, in the sediment and shadows of this hellish world, the universe's most improbable experiment was about to begin. Life, it seems, has always had a twisted sense of humour about where it chooses to start. Imagine floating in those ancient seas 540 million years ago, and then something extraordinary begins to happen. The water around you starts to shimmer with movement. Strange shapes emerge from the murky depths, creatures that had never existed before, as if the ocean itself had suddenly learned to dream. And what dreams they were. Trilobites scuttled across the seafloor on dozens of jointed legs, their compound eyes glittering like jewelled helmets made of calcite crystal. Some grew spines that jutted from their shells like medieval armour, while others developed eyes on stalks that could swivel and search like biological periscopes. Swimming above them came Anomalocaris, 6 feet of graceful nightmare, propelling itself with fins that rippled like silk scarves while its front appendages reached out with surgical precision. Then there were creatures that seemed to exist solely to puzzle future scientists. Wiwaxia crawled like a living medieval mace, covered in spines that stuck out in impossible directions. Hallucigenia was so bizarre that when paleontologists found it, they spent decades reconstructing it upside down because they couldn't figure out which end was the head. What you were witnessing was evolution's first arms race. Shells appeared almost overnight as creatures desperately tried to protect themselves from neighbours who had discovered sharp teeth. Then claws evolved to crack those shells. Spines grew to discourage those claws. Eyes became more sophisticated, able to spot danger from greater distances. In just a few million years, life went from simple creatures hiding in mud to an underwater circus of predators and prey. The Cambrian seas had rewritten the rules of being alive, and those rules have governed life ever since. Let me take you forward 50 million years to when the ocean had become something magnificent. Picture yourself diving into waters so clear you could see for hundreds of feet, through reefs that stretched across continents like underwater mountain ranges. Nautiloids, some the size of city buses, moved through these depths like living submarines, their tentacles exploring every shadow. These were intelligent hunters that communicated through skin patterns and coordinated attacks with mathematical precision. Below them, crinoids swayed like underwater gardens, their feathery arms filtering nutrients from water so rich with plankton it sometimes shimmered green in the sunlight. Trilobites had evolved into hundreds of forms, some blind cave dwellers navigating by touch, others sporting elaborate spines that made them look like underwater peacocks. The reefs rose like limestone cities, built by creatures that had mastered underwater architecture millions of years before humans picked up their first tools. For 50 million years, this empire thrived in perfect stability. Each species found its place in an ecosystem that seemed immune to change. Fish were still primitive, jawless things, more like swimming worms than predators. The real power belonged to creatures in shells who had turned the ocean into their personal kingdom. Until one day, without warning, the kingdom began to die. It started with subtle cooling, so gradual no creature could notice within its lifetime. But glaciers began forming at the poles, locking up water and dropping sea levels by hundreds of feet. Those magnificent shallow seas started draining away like bathtubs with their plugs pulled. When it ended, 85% of all ocean species were gone. The silence that followed echoed through empty depths like a funeral song for an entire world. But life has never been good at staying defeated. In the shallow seas that remained, survivors began experimenting with possibilities that had never existed before. The most audacious experiment was about to unfold on the barren shores of an empty continent. Ancient coastlines, miles of rocky beach stretching endlessly, unmarked by footprints, unshaded by trees, silent except for waves and wind. The land was a canvas waiting 4 billion years for its first artists. And from tidal pools where survivors huddled, something began moving onto that empty stage. They were small at first, primitive plants that looked more like green slime than forests. But they discovered something revolutionary. Photosynthesis worked better on land, with all that available sunlight. Within millions of years, the first forests appeared. Simple, with shallow roots, but forests nonetheless. Following the plants came arthropods, in forms that would make modern nature documentaries look tame. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than dinner tables patrolled humid air above fern meadows. Millipedes 8 feet long crawled through underbrush, and spiders the size of house cats, with faces you could see expressions on. In the seas, fish discovered the advantages of having mouths that could actually bite. Jawed fish exploded across oceans like a biological arms race declared overnight. Dunkleosteus reached 30 feet long, developing cutting plates that could slice through anything with industrial efficiency. Then came the moment that changed everything. In some forgotten tidal pool, a nameless fish flopped out of water and kept breathing. The first vertebrate had made the journey from sea to land, carrying the blueprint for every animal that would ever walk across our planet's surface. Step into the Carboniferous world, and you'd need to remind yourself you were still on planet Earth. The air itself was different, so rich in oxygen that a single spark could turn entire forests into walls of flame that burned for months. Everything grew to sizes that seem impossible today, as if the planet had decided to experiment with biology's upper limits. Tree ferns rose over 100 feet into humid, cathedral-like canopies, so thick the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. The air hung heavy with moisture and decay, as countless plant generations died and were buried in swamps that would become the coal we mine today. Moving through this prehistoric jungle were creatures from nightmares. Arthropleura, millipedes the length of small cars, rustled through undergrowth on dozens of legs. Meganeura, dragonflies with 2-foot wingspans, patrolled clearings like prehistoric helicopters. And spiders that hunted in packs, some growing to dinner plate size with leg spans covering your entire torso. In warm shallows bordering these forests, amphibians had grown to ridiculous proportions. Prionosuchus stretched over 30 feet long, looking like inflated cartoon crocodiles. These were apex predators that could take down anything venturing too close to water's edge. But this oxygen-rich paradise came with a terrible price. Fire was everywhere, a constant threat that could consume entire continents. Lightning didn't start small brush fires. It ignited conflagrations visible from space, walls of flame racing faster than any creature could run. For 60 million years, this impossible world of giants endured. But like every golden age in Earth's history, it was building toward an ending that would make previous extinctions look like minor inconveniences. The Permian began with such promise. For 50 million years, life had perfected the art of living on land, and the results were spectacular. But by the end, our planet would come closer to complete lifelessness than at any point in its history. Let your mind drift. To supercontinent Pangaea, all Earth's landmasses fused into one massive piece of real estate, surrounded by a single ocean. The interior was a furnace, thousands of miles from any sea breeze, baking under temperatures that could kill most modern life within hours. Deserts stretched for distances that would take months to cross, broken only by scattered oases where forest clung to shrinking rivers. Creatures in this hostile world had adapted to impossible extremes. Gorgonopsids, bear-sized predators built like reptilian wolves, hunted across landscapes so hot that rocks cracked in the sun. Their prey had developed cooling systems, allowing them to survive temperatures that would cook modern mammals from the inside out. Then came the worst catastrophe in Earth's history. Deep beneath Siberia, volcanic forces built toward eruptions that would dwarf anything in recorded history. The Siberian traps were geological apocalypse, pumping poison into the atmosphere for hundreds of thousands of years. The volcanic gases weren't just hot, they were acidic, toxic, so abundant they turned rain into limestone-dissolving acid. Temperatures spiked until ocean surfaces resembled hot baths. Oxygen plummeted so low that breathing became a struggle. Hydrogen sulfide bubbled from oceans, turning air itself into poison gas that killed with a single breath. 90% of all species vanished. Entire ecosystems collapsed so completely their fossil records simply end. For millions of years, the planet existed barely alive, a wounded world struggling to remember how life was supposed to work. And just when it seemed like Earth's experiment with complex life was over, when the planet had become little more than a graveyard orbiting the sun, something stirring in the wasteland refused to give up. 10 million years. That's how long it took for life to remember how to be diverse again. 10 million years of empty landscapes slowly, tentatively filling with creatures that looked nothing like what came before. The survivors of the Great Dying had inherited an alien world, and they were about to remake it entirely. Starting with the early Triassic coastlines, warm, humid places where strange new reptiles basked on black volcanic sand. These weren't anything like the creatures that had ruled the Permian world. Evolution had learned its lesson about putting all its eggs in the giant-sized basket. The new rulers were smaller, quicker, more adaptable, and among them, scurrying through fern forests on long legs, were the first dinosaurs. You wouldn't have been impressed by them at first glance. Eoraptor was barely 3 feet long, weighing less than a large dog. Herrerasaurus might have reached 10 feet, but it spent most of its time hunting creatures the size of rabbits. These early dinosaurs were opportunists, taking advantage of ecological niches left empty by the Great Extinction. But there were others competing for dominance in this recovering world. Rauisuchians, crocodile-like predators that could grow to 20 feet long, ruled the landscape with bone-crushing jaws. For a while, it seemed like they might be the ones to inherit the Earth. The Triassic was evolution's rough draft of what would become the Age of Reptiles, a world rebuilding itself from nothing, experimenting with forms that would either flourish or vanish as the planet continued its long recovery from near death. 50 million years after the Great Dying, Earth had remembered how to dream big again, and the Jurassic period was when those dreams became towering reality. Walk through a Jurassic forest, and you'd need to crane your neck until it ached, just to see the tops of the creatures around you. Brachiosaurus stretched 70 feet into the sky, their heads disappearing into canopies of ancient conifers. The ground trembled with each step as herds of sauropods moved across landscapes that looked like green cathedrals built for giants. But these gentle titans shared their world with predators that could make your blood freeze. Allosaurus stalked through fern meadows with the patient grace of death itself, its serrated teeth designed to slice through anything smaller than a city bus. When it hunted, the forest fell silent except for the sound of massive footsteps and the crack of breaking bones. The oceans had become equally magnificent and terrifying. Plesiosaurs with necks longer than telephone poles swept through shallow seas, while Leedsichthys, a fish the size of a whale, filtered plankton through jaws that could swallow a small boat. But the true monsters of these ancient waters were the pliosaurs, marine reptiles with heads the size of small cars, and jaws powerful enough to crush a great white shark like a potato chip. Above it all, pterosaurs ruled the skies on wings of stretched skin and hollow bones. Pteranodons soared on thermals that rose from sun-warmed forests, their shadows passing over a world that had achieved a kind of biological perfection. This was life operating at maximum volume, an ecosystem so abundant and diverse it seemed like it could last forever. The Jurassic world was evolution's masterpiece, a symphony of size and diversity that has never been matched. But masterpieces, as any artist knows, are fragile things. The Cretaceous period was when evolution decided to show off. For 80 million years, life on Earth reached levels of complexity and diversity that make modern ecosystems look like rough sketches by comparison. This was the golden age of dinosaurs, the time when reptiles achieved absolute dominance over land, sea, and sky. Tyrannosaurus rex stalked through forests of flowering plants, a completely new invention that painted the world in colours it had never seen before. 40 feet long, with teeth like railroad spikes and a bite force that could crush a small car, T-Rex was evolution's ultimate predator. When it roared, the sound could be heard for miles, a declaration of dominance that every creature in the forest understood. In the oceans, mosasaurs prowled like sea serpents from ancient legends. Tylosaurus stretched 50 feet through water, warm enough for tropical coral reefs to flourish at the North Pole. These marine lizards had jaws lined with teeth designed for one purpose: making anything smaller than themselves disappear in a cloud of blood and scales. But perhaps the most spectacular rulers of the Cretaceous skies were the pterosaurs. Quetzalcoatl stood as tall as a giraffe and had a wingspan that could cover a tennis court. When one of these giants took flight, it was like watching a small airplane with a heartbeat launch itself into the sky. The world was warm, lush, and filled with more species than had ever existed at any point in Earth's history. Flowers attracted insects that had never existed before. Those insects were eaten by small mammals that scurried through underbrush, staying out of sight of the giants that ruled above them. But something was already hurtling toward Earth through the darkness of space. A countdown had begun that would end this golden age forever. The dinosaurs' reign was about to face its final test. 66 million years ago, on what started as an ordinary Tuesday in the Cretaceous period, the universe played its cruelest joke on planet Earth. A rock the size of a mountain, travelling faster than anything has a right to move, slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of 1 billion atomic bombs going off at once. The impact crater stretched over 100 miles across, but that was just the beginning of the horror show. The collision sent shock waves around the globe that triggered earthquakes powerful enough to flatten entire mountain ranges. Tsunamis taller than skyscrapers raced across oceans, carrying marine reptiles miles inland where they died, gasping on ground that had never seen seawater before. But the real killer wasn't the impact itself, it was what came after. Vaporized rock and debris shot into the atmosphere like a shotgun blast aimed at the sky, then fell back down as molten glass rain that turned the entire planet into a furnace. Forests that had stood for millions of years burst into flames spontaneously. Animals that had survived the initial shockwaves died of burns and smoke inhalation as their world transformed into a vision of hell. Then came the darkness. Dust and ash from the impact blocked out the sun completely, plunging Earth into a nuclear winter that lasted for months. Temperatures plummeted so quickly that tropical plants froze solid within hours. Photosynthesis stopped. Food chains collapsed from the bottom up like dominoes falling in slow motion. The great dinosaurs, lords of the Earth for over 160 million years, found themselves facing an enemy they couldn't fight, couldn't intimidate, couldn't outlast. Within a few thousand years, barely a blink of an eye in geological time, they were gone. All except for a few small, feathered survivors that would eventually learn to fly and become the birds that sing outside your window today. In the silence that followed the dinosaurs' extinction, something small and furry poked its nose out of a burrow and sniffed the ash-covered air. The mammals had been waiting for this moment for over 100 million years. Hiding in shadows, staying small, surviving on scraps while giants ruled the world above them. Now the giants were gone, and the meek were finally about to inherit the Earth. Within just a few million years, lightning speed in evolutionary terms, mammals exploded into every ecological niche the dinosaurs had left empty. Some stayed small and quick, perfecting the art of survival through intelligence and adaptability. Others grew large, experimenting with size in ways that would have made their tiny ancestors proud. Indracotherium, a hornless rhinoceros, reached heights that let it browse leaves from trees 30 feet off the ground. The ice ages that followed sculpted both the landscape and its inhabitants into forms that would seem almost familiar today. Saber-toothed cats perfected the art of killing creatures much larger than themselves. Giant ground sloths, some the size of small elephants, shambled through forests that stretched from Alaska to Argentina. Woolly mammoths developed fur so thick they could survive temperatures that would freeze modern elephants solid. And in the tropical forests of Africa, something unprecedented was happening. Primates were developing larger brains, more sophisticated tools, and the beginnings of language. They were still small, still vulnerable, still just another species among millions. But they were learning to use fire, to hunt in coordinated groups, to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. The Cenozoic era was evolution's final dress rehearsal before the strangest experiment of all was about to take the stage. An experiment that would, within just a few million years, change the rules of life on Earth more dramatically than any asteroid impact ever could. And then, in what amounts to less than a heartbeat in Earth's long history, something new appeared on the African savanna. Something that walked upright on two legs, carried fire in its hands, and possessed a brain capable of wondering about its own existence. For 4.5 billion years, Earth had been writing its own story. Species appeared, flourished, and vanished according to rules written in genetics and geology, climate and chemistry. But this new creature was different. It didn't just adapt to its environment, it began changing the environment to suit itself. Within just a few thousand years, these upright apes had spread across every continent except Antarctica. They developed agriculture, which allowed them to support populations larger than any single ecosystem could naturally sustain. They built cities that glowed like stars when viewed from space. They domesticated other species, turning wolves into dogs and wild grasses into wheat. They created art, music, literature, science, things that served no survival purpose, yet somehow made their existence more meaningful. And in the span of just a few centuries, these clever primates have triggered what scientists are calling the sixth mass extinction. Species are vanishing at rates not seen since the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. The climate is warming faster than it has in millions of years. The very chemistry of the oceans is changing. This new species has proven more powerful than volcanic eruptions, more transformative than ice ages, more influential than cosmic impacts. They are rewriting the rules of evolution itself, and no one, including them, knows how this chapter of Earth's story is going to end. The planet that gave birth to everything you've ever known, that survived ice ages and asteroid impacts and volcanic apocalypses, that rebuilt itself from near total extinction multiple times, now faces its most unpredictable challenge yet. You, us, the strangest experiment Earth has ever produced, and perhaps the most dangerous. The story of life on Earth isn't over. It may, in fact, have only just begun.